begin to look at our in-practice judgment.
The other aspect which is my concern is that our regulatory body is not here. And we don't know enough about the regulatory body and its expectations and its rules. I don't think we have a rule of the regulatory body. And the other thing is that when we started the diploma and so on, we were told that it would allow us to practice internationally with the certificates we get. And now there is some confusion as to yes or no. So, because if there's a regulatory body, a national regulatory body, one can sort of find out, and sort of there are obviously cultural and other things which are not topmost on the list, but it's our regulatory body and we can communicate. But here there is as such no communication, and it's sort of a body in the air. We don't know much about it.
Well, I think you're in a position to potentially try and develop that in a particular way. I mean, there isn't a right way in doing this, and in the UK we have a spectrum of beliefs amongst practitioners. Yeah, don't imagine that there is agreement, because there isn't. Yeah, there are some practitioners who, like in the UK, there is no regulation whatsoever in terms of who to practice. Of who can practice. Believe it or not, there is no statutory regulation. It does not exist. Anybody can practice in the UK. Okay?
Without any degree?
Without any
I
degrees.
actually wrote to them, and
We
the
could-
council
yeah.
wrote to me and she said the same thing to me.
You can, in legally, there is no legal regulation. Okay? So anybody can put a copper plate on their door and say that you are a counsellor or a psychotherapist. There is no chartered status to it. Yeah? And there are some people, and I can kind of edge into, yeah, that's an interesting argument, who would say that that is a good thing. Yeah? And we'll talk about that, why that is so, and then there are others who want it to be super regulated, yeah, with, on a legal basis, and that will mean that, the training will be absolutely regulated, the qualification will be regulated, and everybody who does the work, will be regulated. Now we do have some regulation, I'm not saying that we don't, but we have professional member bodies who legally have no standing. That kind of sounds a bit weird, but I don't have to be a member of any of those in order to practice. And we may ask ourselves, is that ethically sound or not? That's where that comes in. Yeah. There are several professional bodies, some of whom do have chartered status. Okay, so the British Psychological Society, which is where there are psychologists, does have chartered status. They tend to be fairly medical model orientated. Yeah. And those are a number of the people who would work in, say, the NHS. So, yeah.
When we have time, I know that we're running out of time, can you explain, because I'm still confused about what is a counsellor and what is a psychotherapist? Because
I can't give you a clear definition of that because there isn't one. Okay. What I can, and that was part of the problem when we in the UK had this process of potentially being a regulated profession. and there was a huge fallout between people saying, determine what is counselling, determine what is psychotherapy in terms of your practice. And there was lots of discussion about it's about the depth, but what we find is I have colleagues who trained as counsellors and after years of practice work at great depth.
Yes.
You know, there is a joke that we have in the profession, which is what's the difference between a counsellor and a psychotherapist? And the joke is we say usually about £30,000 in your training.
So we are
Makes
considered
sense.
psychotherapists, or we're not?
I don't know.
I think we are. But then
What
they
are
charge
you
you.
The more you've paid,
No, that's the joke. That's the joke. But like there are, you know, in UKCP has a set of standards of working, and we do. I mean, it is complex, and it is for another thing. Like I'm interested in why people want to call themselves psychotherapists as opposed to counsellors, because I suspect it's to do with you, and status. Like, and I'm not saying you, but I'm saying that like that exists. It exists in the UK. It's about status. It's actually not about where am I in my practice? How much do I value that, you know, those years of being in weekly therapy? Because that's where the expense is. You know, what was it for me? Like when I did my training, and maybe I see this as a badge of honour potentially, but when I did my training, you know, like in my very first clinical work, I had to do, I wasn't allowed more than one client, more than one patient for the first 6 months of my practice. And for each session I had with my client, I had one session of supervision. Okay, I was taught in the old analytical way, which is where you do your learning with your supervisor. You learn from the ground. That was costly, of course it was, but the point is what did that process show me as a practitioner? What did I learn in that process? What did I value in that process? Because that's the stuff that I can't, you know, you can't necessarily immediately qualify. But you know, the work in some ways is potentially around, I guess, how deeply do you work, and how deeply do you work? A lot of that is about self-reflexivity. A lot of that is about my capacity to understand deep unconscious processes, as I understand it. It's about my capacity to bear witness. We were looking at that yesterday in our workshop around my capacity to bear witness to suffering, and so on. Maybe. But very often this debate around being a counsellor and a psychotherapist is often about status. The reality is, interestingly, in the UK, is that because of the way in which the work gets marketed, as a counsellor you are probably much more likely to get work than you are as a psychotherapist.
Yeah, that's what I was reading.
And you ask, why is that? Well, it's about business. And it's that one of the professional bodies, BACP, which, you know, has traditionally been the counsellors' body, has done a great job in putting itself out there in the world. So then when it comes to, you know, to people, BACP becomes the kite mark. So if you're a member of BACP, then you are likely to be in the market more for work. UKCP hasn't been quite so successful. It's trying really hard to get itself out there. And so often your status in BACP is much more likely to, to be a good selling point for work. Yeah, is that what your work's about? Ask yourself that question. And for some people, work will be about, I need to make a living. In which case that stuff will be valuable. Yeah. I'm kind of giving all of this because it's a complex thing, around our work, So there are those who will heartily support the business model of counselling and psychotherapy, that we need to get out there and make money. Yeah. There are others on another perspective who would say, hold on a minute, that potentially deeply impacts on the work that I do. Yeah. As a counsellor or a psychotherapist, am I comfortable in just taking work that allows me that only gives me 6 sessions with clients? Is that the work that I've trained to do? Yeah. And that's fine, that practitioners often do have to do 6-session works, in order to get the business and to do the work. But can you see, it becomes a really complex area. It's, so am I a counsellor, am I a psychotherapist? The question that I would ask is, well, there isn't a clear definition. BACP wants both titles in its name. It used to be BAC, if you knew that. It used to be the British Association of Counselling, and the other body was UKCP, which the UK Council for Psychotherapy. What both of them do now is, so now UKCP has a counselling section. Yeah. So you can join UKCP as a psychotherapeutic counsellor. You can, BACP, people, often BACP courses are much shorter, so you fit in with a model of, of the counselling training. Psychotherapy training tends to be much longer. That's why we talk about it's the difference of £30,000.
So level 5 is also counselling.
And that's been a big debate when people were planning to
Does
join.
it feel like counselling? Well, there's a thing. There's a thing. Like for me, this is where I say, why are you doing the training? Is it to be a more accomplished practitioner? Or will you only do it if it has the badge of psychotherapy? This is such an interesting debate, isn't it? I'm an external examiner in the UK, so I work with several trainings. So I'm employed by the university that gives the MA status to therapy trainings. Yeah. So some therapy trainings in the UK happen in universities. Some trainings happen, MA trainings happening in organisations who get their accreditation from the university. Does that make sense? Yeah. Trainings that do their MA trainings, and they tend to be MA in psychotherapy, will get their accreditation from particular universities, which means they have to do certain kinds of hoop jumping in order to get the MA, which an MA is level 7. Okay, that's the agreed status. But in order to get an MA, you have to do the university hoop jumping to get it, which does mean that the training gets skewed into delivering a number of outcome essays and research things. Yeah. I'm also external moderator for another training, which has chosen to just stay at level 7, get its UKCP acknowledged, but it has refused to go down a university pathway because it feels it does this with their training. Yeah, it's a very soulful training, and so it has still held back from doing their training as an MA. And the only reason why they would want to do it as an MA is, and they say, is that, like, you know, because people now want the status of an MA. And I find that deeply sad. I find that really, really sad, you know, that it's not the training, but the status. And it may be that also, you know, because maybe there is a market out there of people who will say, well, you can't be any good if you haven't got an MA. Is that true? Is that so? Yeah. You know, but can you see what we're talking about here is like, it's about status. Is this about practice? Probably not. Yeah. So that question when people say, is this counselling or is it psychotherapy? You know, like for me it's a question of depth. You know, but you know, people who have done an early counselling training, their in-practice judgment, their practice work determines or will begin to describe the depth to which they work, the knowledge to which they have of their practice. Can you see that? Yeah. Not what the MA says they have to do. Yeah. So it's a complex arena. Yeah.
And at the same time, the way work works, those who come from Colorado or wherever else, and they got their qualification, it does make a difference.
Yeah. But you know, some of the best teachers within the field, you know, have been the people who go rogue, Yolong, yeah, who you know, who have maybe not been through those things. You know, my teachers, you know, granted they were a long time ago, but they don't have an MA to their name, and they actively choose not to do that.
That era was very different to this era.
Pardon?
The times as they evolve,
Yeah.
now these qualifications are important in all fields.
I
And,
feel like
and important for ...
I think, you know, sort of the training, the structured training that comes through the validation of the training achieved, and the basic training that is there with the underlying, you know, sort of successive learning that has gone on through the MA. All those things, other than the wanting to be in a position or recognize strata, but in this day and age, every child is told to get a postgraduate qualification if they want to survive and work.
So I guess what you're saying is it's an aspiration that people have.
Necessity.
it's more like a requirement, I think,
Yes,
what I
it's
hear
necessity.
you saying.
That's what
I
she said.
felt like sharing something on a lighter note. Is it okay? A student of mine, who I had taught 15 years back, came to me. He visited our faculty and he said, you know, ma'am, I have something. He was telling me about his success as a lawyer and all that. And he said, you know, how I started off? I went to the court with my senior, who is a Supreme Court advocate. And he said, now this is your first day, I'm going to send you a client. Don't ask for more than 15,000 rupees. That's a huge amount, but I think you can manage it. So, say you will charge him 15,000, he needs a stay. So that's his relief. So this student of mine said, well, when the client came to me, he told me the problem. I said, sir, I am going to charge you 10 lakh rupees for this. And the senior went ballistic, he said, he was standing at the back of the client and he said, what are you doing? He said, I am going to deliver you your stay, but I will be charging this much. So the client said, what? You will be charging me so much? That's too much. I'll give you 8 lakhs. So he said, okay, because you've been referred by my senior, I will take 8 lakhs from you. And he said, ma'am, I understood I could deliver the relief of the client, the stay. I understood that what the client wanted, I could deliver that. And from then on, I never looked back. I didn't take my senior's advice because for him, I was just a lowly, beginner. But for me, I had that confidence that I could deliver, and my client's need was something I had to put before anybody's need. I didn't have to impress my senior. And it was so interesting for me, that kind of confidence. So sometimes you don't need to have the seniority of the certification as a lawyer. You have to first become a high court lawyer, then you have to pass a certain number of years and then become a Supreme Court lawyer. The exam you have to pass. Sometimes the wisdom comes at a very junior level. You do not have that grading, but you have that wisdom.
And I guess one of the things that we're looking at here, and that's absolutely true, but we're also kind of like if that person is able to say, with a real kind of grounded awareness, I have the appropriate knowledge for this, I have the appropriate training for this, and I've been through a process that enables me to say, this is where I am. Yeah, and in many ways that's what we do in lawyers, don't we? We go through this apprenticeship process, in order to be able to stand there and say, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing.
But I have to also admit that it was bothering me a lot that CPPD trains a counselor or a therapist in 6 months, whereas in therapy works, we have to work for 2.5 years or 3 years before we get our certificate and then onwards, so many more years. And when we meet each other, they call themselves counselors and therapists, and so do we. So it was bothering me initially. Then I said, we're all healers in our own way, so it's okay.
Well, it's really helpful, this is a really interesting debate around what training do we need in order to do this work. I can't remember if I've ever told you, a colleague of mine in Bristol he's finished now, but worked in the NHS and as a consultant psychotherapist. And what he set up in the unit that he worked with was he kind of had this little training program where he took people who were already working. They might have been healthcare assistants, some of them might have even been former users of the service, and he gave them a fairly minimal amount of training that focused on attachment, a few early developmental theories, and some very good practice-orientated stuff. And the rest of the time they were out on the wards working with people under very deep supervision with him. Okay, and their training lasted, or their experience lasted 2 years. So it was very hands-on training. And he said to me they were the finest practitioners that he'd ever worked with. They came to be the finest practitioners. They didn't get anything out of it at the end of it. There wasn't a certificate, or anything. But what he gave was, was a grounded training. And you can see, and I think they did their own therapeutic work. Yeah. It's a different model. Yeah. And it's one that's grounded on experience. Yeah. You remember the joke, that we were saying around, the Zen master, what's the source of experience? Or what's, what is it? And it's bad judgment, it's that capacity to be out there and learn from experience, that becomes important. But I also think, I'm not saying that having a good theoretical background isn't an important part of it. I'm not saying that. I'm deeply questioning when we say, why am I doing what am I doing? Am I doing this training because it gives status? That's got nothing to do with the work. Can you see? It's got absolutely nothing to do with your work. Yeah. If that was your point, you wouldn't value the training that Martin was doing in Bristol. You'd think it was rubbish training. Yeah? When actually we hear him say they were some of the finest practitioners he'd ever met. Yeah? Why? Because they developed really good in-practice judgment.
I think that's so important because even what we said about going rogue,
Yeah.
even when we go rogue, it's not like completely whimsical, it's not like, oh, right, like we throw everything in all our in-practice judgment to the wind
Yeah.
and we just go blindly into it, right? And so for the lawyer even, in a way he did go rogue.
Yeah.
But my question would be, where is that need of going rogue coming from?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so even when you were talking about the student counselor, and when he went rogue versus when you went rogue, right? They were coming almost from slightly different places, and the reflection that went into going rogue was different.
Well, it's a great thing, isn't it? And this is where this notion of in-practice judgment or judgment-based practice becomes important. Judgment-based practice sounds like it's dreadful, but if you know what I mean. It's where my judgment comes in, and it isn't based on whimsy. I think that's a really good phrase. It's based on the deep knowledge gained from my practice, and that deep knowledge that I gain from my practice, we can share with each other. That then helps the academy. That feeds into our theories and so on. That helps us to develop the practice. So it's an activity of caring that doesn't require abstract evidence, and the application of technique and standardized behaviors, but judgment and a quality of wisdom. Now that's when we kind of, can kind of think, what is wisdom? Well, go back to that old Zen saying, it's one that's based on judgment that didn't work in the past, but it's that kind of informs my practice now. So rather than that abstract evidence, meaning this is what the protocol says, it's abstract to what's happening here and now. But we utilise what our own knowledge develops. And what's really helpful is to hear you guys now saying, yes, but what's right or wrong? That's what you're saying, and I'm saying, let's see. I can't give you that. I can give you a version of it. I can tell you what the books say, I can tell you what, a framework says. But is it right or wrong? I don't know. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be, isn't it? But this is where your research work and others' research work is really important. So So the bit about redemptive subjectivity, I think some of you may have heard this quote before, but I think it's great. This comes from a guy called Arthur Frank, who a long time ago wrote a book called The Wounded Storyteller. And Frank was somebody, he was an academic, a sociologist who did work within hospitals, and he did kind of like sociological medical practice, and he had a life-threatening illness. He had cancer, and his experience, his lived experience of being in the hospital taught him a huge amount about what it's like being a patient and how patients' voices, his voice wasn't heard. And so his work, that experience, really has invited him to really develop a new way of thinking for of how practitioners can be. Yeah, in other words, it's like drop the expert. You actually don't know what it's like. Yeah. And so his quote here, I think, is really helpful for us as practitioners and as researchers, and also the ethics of our practice, when he says one of our most difficult duties as human beings is to listen to the voices of those who suffer. The voices of the ill are easy to ignore, because these voices are often faltering in tone and mixed in message, particularly in their spoken form, before some editor has rendered them fit for reading by the healthy. These voices bespeak conditions of embodiment that most of us would rather forget our vulnerability to. Listening is hard, but it is also a fundamental moral act to realize the best potential in postmodern times requires an ethics of listening for the other. Wow. Good quote. Yeah, really important quote around like how we can let our status, let our or whatever get in the way of actually who's really here. Yeah, of who am I really listening to? Yeah, really, really important. And you know, isn't that a really fine voice, you know, around like where somebody's voice gets edited and then rendered fit for reading by the healthy. Yeah. And actually, when we listen to, you know, there's, you know, like in the States, there's the Black Voices Matter movement, and it's exactly about that. It's about before these voices get edited by some nice white perspective. Yeah. This is what we're talking about. Yeah. It's about kind of really giving voice to those places and to those individuals and to ourselves maybe. And maybe it's kind of like giving voice to my practice before it's rendered fit for publication. Yeah, by a set of, I don't know, protocols. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, when we start to notice that. So the research that you do is one about really getting closer to these voices, getting closer to the knotty issues that we face in our practice, that you face in your practice. What happens to practitioners when we're caught in that place that we'd rather not voice, which is I don't know what to do, and I feel far too vulnerable to tell everybody how scared I am or how rubbish I was in that last encounter, that I won't speak it. So this is the territory that we're in, and I'm loving how you're bringing in stuff. And if I come across as a little passionate, it's because, like, I feel there are voices that need hearing in our work. I feel that there is practice that is worth recording. Yeah. And sometimes we can't do that in those traditional academic methods.
The vision of all our voices somehow being recorded in a book together.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
kind of.
You know, when I say to you, if I have a personal agenda here, you know, when we're here doing this, it is that you will take your work and take it to a wider audience. That you will talk about, the struggles that you have here. What does it mean to have your work validated? What will it mean to set up a regulatory body here? Are you going to do it like the US, or the UK, or Australia? Or are you going to listen to other voices?
They are actually doing that right now. The Sindh government is setting up a regulatory body. It's in process at the moment. We've had a meeting with them. Aisha, Tahir, and myself went for an initial meeting, but something is being put together right now. Originally, it was only for psychiatrists and psychologists. However, now they're also bringing in the broader counseling, psychotherapy, etc. They're also bringing that in.
And only for
Now,
Sindh?
there's a lot of, sorry,
Only for Sindh?
this is done for Sindh, however, it's part of a federal law, so it's probably also going to be done in other provinces.
I think Tahir is also trying to get affiliation with AGC.
That's
federal
different.
laws.
That's not a regulatory.
No, that's
Well,
not,
that's
that's
the level
That's
academic.
academic.
That's good to know.
However, it's good, however, it will probably also be a real struggle because it will be fitting into something that might be very, I don't think they'll fully understand our profession. And I think there's people there like psychiatrists, clinical psychologists who sit there who will be really struggling with what we do.
and look down, that's what I mean.
Yes, they do.
We have an
It's
affiliation
not a
with the
degree.
UK
Like,
regulatory body, then automatically we get an umbrella of international standard. And that will then have less influence from the others who are trying to, who don't understand the value or the position of the body.
it was interesting how one of the critique kind of that came through in that discussion was actually about foreign Western theories being implemented here and not being localized according to the need here. So again, what we'll be doing then here to our research might actually be very, very interesting to present.
I love how the conversation flows to the final, to the final thing that I want to present. This is something I've slightly amended this work from Les Todris, who, as you know, is a real advocate for a kind of a more humanized approach. And in this model, it's really interesting what you're just kind of saying there, because actually what the phrase that we use for things is like, is there a goodness of fit, to the body that you're going to set up with? Is there a goodness of fit? to the theories that you're being taught. Yeah? And in the goodness of fit model, in terms of research, this is where your research really comes in here. Yeah? And the kind of, the sort of research models that we've just been talking about, how you can begin to kind of describe your research in ways that can be utilised well with other practitioners. We call those things like textured qualitative research findings. And when you listen to Richard's piece earlier on, that was textured qualitative research. Can you get that? Like, it was powerful, yeah? It gave you a lot in its research findings. It was textured. And so what we do with that is, like when we think about our goodness of fit model research, is that, our research findings, do they facilitate, in other words, how I give you my research findings, does it facilitate for you an embodied relational understanding? When I gave you Richard's work earlier on, what happened for you?
The thing that we mentioned, I think for a lot of us, we felt a number of emotions and we felt them in our bodies. So it wasn't just that we were processing it cognitively and intellectually, but it was a very experiential learning. So.
You felt it. Yeah. There was a felt sense with it. Yeah. In other words, there was that embodied relational understanding. We could use words like "you got it," in some ways, So the way in which that research was communicated helped you to get it in some ways. So we can talk about that as embodied relational understanding, which then kind of sensitizes you as a practitioner, so that the next time maybe you work with somebody with post-traumatic stress in some way, you're kind of sensitized to their life and to how they might, kind of be experiencing it. Not what they should be experiencing, but it sensitizes your understanding of them.
So is that the deck? Because I can't read this. It's not about the others.
It's too small. That's how it goes. The right bottom, I think, says embodied relational understanding.
I'll go through them if it's not clear. Normally I put my slides to a page, because then,
So that actually answers my question then about how do we use the research. About, it's not about what to expect, but perhaps, finding another way to relate. But perhaps it could be this.
So what we're doing with our research here is like if it's this good textured research, practice-based research, it impacts on an individual. Remember right at the start I was giving you that thing around good research, in inverted commas. This is according to Rosemary Anderson, who wrote a book called Transformational Research. Good research is the one where it impacts on me while I'm doing it. It also potentially impacts on those if I'm doing research with someone. The research impacts on them. It also then, don't worry, I'll go through them. It will then, it kind of impacts on the person who's reading it, the person who's receiving it, because they may not be reading it. It may be given in a countless number of different ways. We were saying earlier on, poetry may work for that. But as long as it kind of gives that embodied relational understanding, which is what poetry does, doesn't it? It's almost like we digest the words, yeah, and it sinks into our bodies, we get it, Same with music or whatever. But it sensitizes us, for when we're out in our practice, that it informs our judgment-based practice. So I may realize as a result of Richard's work that actually I'm not going to apply some kind of particular principle. To my next client, I'm going to really listen to that experience. I really want to say, I really want to get close to that. What's the what the smells like? I'm going to attune my ear to that moment when that client suddenly begins to go into a stage maybe of heightened sensitivity. I now know about that. I now know when I'm working with somebody with post-traumatic stress that there's this potential for that moment of heightened sensitivity. Yeah, that moment when it happens, like Richard describes, when suddenly the moment stops, he feels his heart. Yeah, there's a silence, but within that silence he hears things, he feels things. Yeah, that's that moment of heightened sensitivity. My judgment-based practice then says, I wonder if that's here then. Let me linger longer with this client. Yeah? Let me really see whether, what that's like. Let me then reflect that back to my client. Wow. Time stood still and you really felt things then. Yeah? And then, if you like, that judgment-based practice, my own, will then allow me to describe that to others. Yeah, can you see how the model circulates? That might then get shared within my peer group. Yeah, do you get this? Yeah, this is how it works. So it begins with the first picture says textured qualitative research findings. Yeah, and what I say is that's the kind of research that gives that textured quality, that facilitates, that's the second word, embodied relational understanding. It impacts on me. Yeah? This isn't just some dry statement around, and then a patient may experience heightened sensitivity to the experience. That's actually what Rich is telling you. But you have an embodied relational understanding. The research describes it to you. Yeah? You're then sensitized to that. You get it. You get heightened sensitivity. This is just one example of Rich's sort of, ethno-autographic report there, which informs your judgment-based practice, your work in action.
I'm just connecting it here to Michael's theory, talking about fragments into the work with the client, right? And how it very much actually falls within this model of being able to observe the fragments in all its many different forms.
Rather than trying to do something.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
And how those fragments also then inform us and make us more sensitive than as a practitioner.
Exactly. Do you really get that? For me, that's a really lovely moment when you kind of relate it to practice. Is anybody unclear about what Anita was saying there? Are you unclear? Or do you want, does Anita need to say more about that?
Could you just repeat it, Anita? I think I missed some part. How did
It
you
was,
link
it was just as I was, like that embodied relational understanding. I was thinking about how, and thinking about the story of Richard and that embodied experience there that came in, and how then with Michael's fragments, for example, the body fragments, the behavior fragments, etc., how that is very much then actually that the understanding that it gives us about the